So, hello and welcome back to another new book. We are still swimming around in the public domain where it seems there are a lot of books that I have never heard of, but you dig a little deeper and you're surprised, and that is where this book ends up. And that is we are going to be beginning Beverly of Graustark. It is by George Barr McCutcheon, who I had never heard of. This book caught my eye when I was going through the thrift store where I found a bunch of public domain books, and these are all original copies too, which I think is so cool. Like, this book has the original illustrations in it, and that was what drew me to it. I mean, that's just such a pretty drawing on the front of it. So I opened it up and I read a tiny little bit and I said, you know, we'll take it home and give it a try. So I first Googled it and found out that this is kind of cool. And this is something I'm looking forward to when we finish it, is this book also has a movie adaptation. And that movie adaptation is also in the public domain. So when we finish this book, I think we're going to do maybe a little like watch party if I can figure out how to do it. Do a little live stream watching the movie, which I have found out does deviate from the book in a few key ways. I still have not read this book. This will be a fresh read through, but I did a little bit of poking because I was a little leery. Not because of anything that I was entirely sure of, but I had been flipping through and I saw a few things and I was like, this is interesting. And I did find out by Googling on Goodreads and a couple of other places that this book generally has good reviews, along with a movie adaptation. I found out that it is actually the second book in a trilogy, but can be read as a standalone, which is good because I have no idea where the other two books, where to even get them, except on Project Gutenberg, which does have everything. And the bad reviews that I saw about this book all pretty much pointed at one thing, and that has to do with the time period when it was written. This book was written not too long after America's Civil War, and it was written by a very Southern author, kind of one of those "the South will rise again" types. So it has a prominent African American character who is not sympathetically portrayed. I'm going to try my best, especially since looking at some of the dialogue, I don't know if I can even get some of the stuff that she says out of my mouth because it's not good. This is a character who, in all honesty, probably, if this was a real person, would have been our main character Beverly's slave, who had then been emancipated and was now her maidservant. Not the best situation, but at least I'm forewarned going in, and now you're forewarned as well. I don't think that is depicted in the movie version, which makes me a little bit more curious to see the movie version. Also, this George Barr McCutcheon is the author of a book that also got adapted into a movie that I have heard of, probably even have seen, but so long ago I don't really remember much about it, except I think it was a comedy. But George Barr McCutcheon wrote Brewster's Millions, which is one that I definitely have heard of. So, interesting. So with all of that being said, we will take a look, and I will show you whenever we get these beautiful pictures, because they're also on the inside of the book. They're in color. We will begin this book, which was published In 1904, by the Dodd, Mead and Company, the illustrations in this book are by Harrison Fisher. Amazing talent, beautiful. Like I'm really liking the illustrations in this. But we are going to now commence Beverly of Graustark by George Barr McCutcheon. And we will be beginning with Chapter 1, which is titled East of the Setting Sun. Far off in the mountain lands, somewhere to the east of the setting sun, lies the Principality of Graustark, serene relic of rare old feudal days. The traveler reaches the little domain after an arduous, sometimes perilous journey from the great European capitals, whether they be north or south or west, never east. He crosses great rivers and wide plains. He winds through fertile valleys and over barren plateaus. He twists and turns and climbs among somber gorges and rugged mountains. He touches the cold clouds in one day and the placid warmth of the valley in the next. One does not go to Graustark for a pleasure jaunt. It is too far from the rest of the world, and the ways are often dangerous because of the strife among the tribes of the intervening mountains. If one hungers for excitement and peril, he finds it in the journey from the north or the south into the land of the Graustarkans. From Vienna and other places almost directly west, the way is not so full of thrills, for the railroad skirts the darkest of the dangerous lands. Once in the heart of Graustark, however, the traveler is charmed into dreams of peace and happiness and paradise. The peasants and the poets sing in one voice and accord, their psalm being of never-ending love. Down in the lowlands and up in the hills, the simple worker of the soil rejoices that he lives in Graustark. In the towns and villages, the humble merchant and his thrifty customer unite to sing the song of peace and contentment. In the palaces of the noble, the same patriotism warms its heart with thoughts of Graustark the ancient. Prince and pauper strike hands for the love of the land, while outside, the great heartless world goes rumbling on without a thought of the rare little principality among the eastern mountains. In point of area, Graustark is but a mite in the great galaxy of nations. Glancing over the map of the world, one is almost sure to miss the infinitesimal patch of green that marks its location. One could not be blamed if he regarded the spot as topographical or an illusion. Yet the people of this quaint little land hold in their hearts a love and confidence that is not surpassed by any of the lordly monarchs who measure their patriotism by miles and millions. The Graustarkians are a sturdy, courageous race. From the faraway century when they fought themselves clear of the Tartar yoke, to this very hour they have been warriors of might and valor. The boundaries of their tiny domain were kept inviolate for hundreds of years, and but one victorious foe had come down to lay siege to Edelweiss, the capital. Axphain, a powerful principality in the north, had conquered Graustark in the latter part of the 19th century, but only after a bitter war in which starvation and famine proved far more destructive than the arms of the victors. The Treaty of Peace and the indemnity that fell to the lot of the vanquished Graustark have been talked about at length in at least one history. Those who have followed that history must know, of course, that the reigning princess, Yetive, was married to a young American at the very tag end of the 19th century. This admirable couple met in quite the romantic fashion while the young sovereign was traveling incognito through the United States of America. The American, a splendid fellow named Laurie, was so persistent in the subsequent attack upon her heart that all ancestral prejudices were swept away and she became his bride with the full consent of her entranced subjects. The manner in which he wooed and won this young, adorable ruler forms a very attractive chapter in romance, though it's unmentioned in history. This being the tale of another day, it is not timely to dwell upon the interesting events which led up to the marriage of Princess Yetive to Grenfall Lorry. Suffice it to say that Laurie won his bride against all wishes and odds, and at the same time won endless love and esteem from the people of the little kingdom among the eastern hills. 2 years have passed since that notable wedding in Edelweiss. Laurie and his wife, the princess, made their home in Washington, but spent a few months of each year in Edelweiss. During the period spent in Washington and in travel, her affairs in Graustark were in the hands of a capable, austere old diplomat, her uncle, Count Caspar Halfont. Princess Volga reigned as regent over the Principality of Axphen. To the south lay the Principality of Dwarsbergen, ruled by young Prince Dantan, whose half-brother, the deposed Prince Gabriel, had been for 2 years a prisoner in Graustark. The convicted assassin of Prince Lorenz of Axphen, a one-time suitor for the hand of the fair Yetive. 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 It was after the second visit of the Lorrys to Edelweiss that a serious turn of affairs presented itself. Gabriel had succeeded in escaping from his dungeon. His friends in Dawsbergen stirred up a revolution, and Dantan was driven from the throne at Saros. On the arrival of Gabriel at the capital, the army of Dawsbergen espoused the cause of the prince that it had spurred, and 3 days after his escape, he was on his throne, defying Yetive and offering a price for the head of the unfortunate Dantan, now a fugitive in the hills along the Graustark frontier. Bum, bum, bum. That was a lot of political history, but that is the end of chapter 1. We're probably going to do 2 or 3 tonight after I grab a drink. Chapter 2, Beverly Calhoun. Major George Calhoun was a member of Congress from one of the southern states. His forefathers had represented the same commonwealth, and so it was likely would his descendants, if there is virtue in the fitness of things and the heredity of love. Well, intrepid frontiersmen were opening the trails through the fertile wilds west of the Alleghenies. A strong branch of the Calhoun family followed close in their footsteps. The Major's great-grandfather saw the glories and possibilities in this new territory and struck boldly westward from the old revolutionary grounds, abandoning the luxuries and tradition of the Carolinas for a fresh, wild life of promise. His sons and daughters became solid stones in the foundation of a commonwealth, and his grandchildren are still at work on the structure. State and national legislatures had known the Calhouns from the very beginning. Battlefields had tested their valor, and drawing rooms had proven their gentility. Major Calhoun had fought with Stonewall Jackson and won his spurs, and at the same time the heart and hand of Betty Haswell, the staunchest Confederate who ever made flags, bandages, and prayers for the boys in gray. When the Reconstruction came, he went to Congress and later on became prominent in the United States Consular Service, for years holding an important European post. Congress claimed him once more in the early 90s, and there he is to this very day. Everybody in Washington's social and diplomatic circles admired the beautiful Beverly Calhoun. According to his own loving terms of identification, she was the Major's youngest. The fair Southerner had seen 2 sessions in the nation's capital. Cupid, standing directly in front of her, had shot his darts ruthlessly and relentlessly into the passing hosts, and masculine Washington looked humbly at Beverly for the balm that might soothe its pains. The wily god of love was fair enough to protect the girl whom he forced to be his unwilling, perhaps unconscious ally. Cupid held his impenetrable shield between her heart and the assaults of an entire army of suitors, both high, low, great, and small. It was not idle rumor that said she had declined a coronet or 2, that the millions of more than one American Midas had been offered to her, and that she had dealt gently but firmly with a score of hearts, which had had nothing but love, ambition, and poverty to support them in their conflict. The Calhouns lived in a handsome home not far from the residence of Mr. and Mrs. Grenfall Lorry. It seemed natural that the 2 beautiful young women should become constant and loyal friends. Women, as lovely as they are, have no reason to be jealous. It is only the woman who does not feel secure of her personal charms that is envious. At the home of Graustark's princess, Beverly met the dukes and barons from the Far East. It was in the warmth of the Calhoun hospitality that Yetive formed her dearest love, her love of the American people. Miss Beverly was neither tall nor short. She was of that divine, indefinite height known as medium. Slender, but perfectly molded, strong but graceful, an absolutely healthy young person whose beauty knew well how to take care of itself. Being heart whole and fancy free, she slept well, ate well, and enjoyed every minute of life. In her blood ran the warm, eager impulses of the South. Hereditary love of ease and luxury displayed itself in every emotion. The perfectly normal demand upon men's admiration was as characteristic in her as it is in any daughter of the land whose women are born to expect chivalry and homage. A couple of years in a New York finishing school for young ladies had served to greatly modify Miss Calhoun's colloquial charms. Many of her delightful way down south phrases and mannerisms were blighted by the cold, unromantic atmosphere of a seminary conducted by 2 ladies from Boston who were too old to marry, too penurious to love, and too prim to think that other women might care to do both of those things. There were times, however, if she were excited or enthusiastic, when pretty Beverly so forgot her training as to break forth with a very attractive y'all and sho enough, or go long now. And when the bands played Dixie, she was not afraid to stand up and wave her handkerchief. The Northerner, who happened to be with her on such occasions, usually found himself doing likewise before he could escape her infectious nature. Miss Calhoun's face was one that painters coveted deep in their artistic souls. It never knew a dull instant. There was expression on every lineament, in every look. There was genuine life, dwelt in the mobile face that turned the head of every man and woman that looked at it. Her hair was a dark brown, and it was abundant. Her eyes a deep gray that looked eagerly from between long lashes of black. Her lips were red and ever willing to smile or turn plaintive as the occasion required. Her brow was broad and fair, and her frown was as dangerous as a smile. As to her age, if the major admitted, somewhat indiscreetly, that all his children were old enough to vote, her mother, with the reluctance born in all women, confessed that she was past 20. So a year or two either way will determine Miss Beverly's age as far as the telling of this story is concerned. Her oldest brother, Keith Calhoun, the one with the congressional heritage, thought that she was too young to marry, while her second brother, Dan, held that soon she was going to be too old to attract any men with matrimonial intentions. Lucy, the only sister, having been happily wedded for 10 years, advised her not to think of marriage until she was old enough to know her own mind. Towards the close of one of the most brilliant seasons the capital had ever known, less than a fortnight before Congress was to adjourn, the wife of Grenfall Lorry received the news which spread gloomy disappointment over the entire social realm. A dozen receptions, teas, and balls were destined to lose their richest attraction, and the hostesses were all in despair. The princess had been recalled to Graustark. Beverly Calhoun was miserably unhappy. She had heard the story of Gabriel's escape and the consequent probability of a conflict with Axphion. It did not require a great stretch of imagination to convince her that the Lorrys were hurrying off to scenes of intrigue, strife, and bloodshed, and that not only Graustark but its princess were now in jeopardy. Miss Calhoun's most cherished hopes faded with the announcement that trouble and not pleasure was calling Yetive back to Edelweiss. It had been their plan that Beverly should spend a delightful summer in Graustark as a guest at the royal palace. The original arrangements of the Lorrys were hopelessly disturbed by the late news from Count Halfont. They were obliged to leave Washington 2 months earlier than they had intended, and they could not take Beverly Calhoun into danger-ridden Graustark. The contemplated visit to St. Petersburg and other pleasures had to be abandoned, and they were in tears. Yetive's maids were packing the trunks, and Lorry's servants were in a wild state of haste preparing for the departure of Saturday's ship. On Friday afternoon, Beverly was naturally where she could do the most good and be of the most help, over at the Lorrys. Self-confessedly, she delayed their preparations. Respectful maidservants and respectful menservants came often to the prince's boudoir to ask questions, and Beverly just as frequently made tearful resolutions to leave the household in peace, if such a hullabaloo could be called peace. Callers came by the dozen, but Yetive would see no one. Letters, telegrams, and telephone calls almost swamped her secretary. The footman and the butler fairly gasped under the strain of all this excitement. Through it all, the two friends sat despondent and alone in the drear room that had once been an abode of pure delight. Grenfall Lorry was off in town closing up all matters of business that could be dispatched, and the princess and her industrious retinue were scheduled to take the evening express for New York, and the next day they would be at sea. "I know I will cry all summer," vowed Miss Calhoun, with conviction in her eyes. "It's just too awful for anything." She was lying back, among the cushions of the divan, and her hat was the picture of cruel neglect. For 3 solid hours she had stubbornly withstood Yetiv's appeals to remove her hat, insisting that she could not trust herself to stay for more than a minute or two. "It seems to me, Yetiv, that your jailers must be very incompetent, or they wouldn't have let loose all this trouble upon you," she said. "Prince Gabriel is the very essence of trouble," said Yetiv. "He was born to annoy people, just like evil princes in a fairy tale." "I wish we had him over here," the American girl answered. "He wouldn't be such trouble, I'm sure. We don't let small troubles worry us very long, you know." "But he is dreadfully important over there, Beverly. That's the difficult part of it," said Yetiv. "You see, he is a condemned murderer." "Then you ought to hang him, or electrocute him, or whatever it is that you do to murderers over there," said Beverly. "But, dear, you don't understand. He won't permit us either to hang or electrocute him, my dear. The situation is precisely the reverse, if he is correctly quoted by my uncle, of course. When Uncle Caspar sent an envoy to inform Dawsbergen respectfully that Graustark would hold it personally responsible if Gabriel were not surrendered, Gabriel himself said, 'Graustark be hanged.'" "Ah, how rude of him! Especially when your uncle was so courteous about it. He must be a very disagreeable person," said Miss Calhoun. "I am sure that you wouldn't like him," said the princess. "His brother, who has been driven from the throne, and the capital, in fact, is quite different. I have not seen him, but my ministers regard him as a splendid young man." "Oh, how I hope he may go back with his army and annihilate that old Gabriel," said Beverly, frowning fiercely. "Alas," said the princess, "he hasn't an army. And besides, he is finding it extremely difficult to keep from being annihilated himself. The army has gone over to Prince Gabriel." "Oh, pooh," said Beverly, who was thinking of the enormous armies that the United States can produce on a day's notice. "What good is a ridiculous little army like his anyway? A battalion from Fort Thomas could beat it to—" "Don't boast, dear," said Yetive with a smile. "Dawsbergen has a standing army of 10,000 excellent soldiers. With the war reserves, she has twice the available force that I can produce." "But your menfolk are so brave," cried Beverly, who had heard their praises sung. "True. God bless them, but you forget that we must attack Gabriel in his own territory. To recapture him means a perilous expedition into the mountains of Dawsbergen, and I am sorely afraid. Oh dear, I hope he'll surrender peaceably." "And go to jail for life?" cried Miss Calhoun. "It is a good deal to expect him, dear. I fancy it's much better fun kicking up a rumpus on the outside than it is kicking your toes off against a stone wall from the inside. You can't blame him for fighting a bit." "No, I suppose not," said the princess. "Gren is actually happy over this whole miserable affair, Beverly. He's full of enthusiasm and positively aching to be in Graustark, right in the thick of it all. To hear him talk, one would think that Prince Gabriel has no show at all. He kept me up until 4 o'clock this morning, telling me that Dawsbergen doesn't know what kind of a snag it was going up against. I have some vague idea what he means by that. His manner did not leave much room for doubt. He also said that we would jolt Dawsbergen off the map. That sounds encouraging, at least, doesn't it?" It sounds very funny for you to say those things, said Beverly, even though they come secondhand. You just were not cut out for slang. Why, I'm sure they're all very good English words, said Yetive. Oh dear, I wonder what they are doing in Graustark right now. Are they fighting or... No, they're merely talking. Don't you know, my dear, that there is never a fight until both sides have talked themselves out of breath? We shall have 6 months of talk and a week or two of fight, just like they always do these days. Oh, you Americans, you have such a comfortable way of looking at things, said the princess. Don't you ever see the serious side of life? My dear, the American always lets the other fella see the serious side of life, said Beverly. You would not be so optimistic if a country much bigger and more powerful than America happened to be the other side. Oh, that did sound frightfully boastful, didn't it? It's the way we're brought up, I reckon. Even us Southerners who know what it's like to be whipped. The idea of a girl like me talking about war and trouble and all that, it's just silly, isn't it? Nonetheless, I wish I could see things through those clear gray eyes of yours. Oh, how I'd like to have you with me through all the months that are going to ensue. You would be such a help to me, such joy. Nothing would seem that hard if you were there to make me see things through your brave American eyes. The princess put her arms around Beverly's neck and pulled her close. But Mr. Lorry has an excellent pair of American eyes, said Beverly. I know, dear, but they are a man's eyes. Sometimes there's a difference, you know. I wouldn't dare cry if he was looking, but I could boo-hoo all day if he were there to comfort me. He thinks I'm very brave, and I'm really not. Oh, I'm an awful coward, said Beverly. I think you're the bravest girl in all the world. Don't you remember what you did at... And then she recalled the stories that had come from Graustark ahead of the bridal party 2 years ago. Yetive was finally obliged to place her hand on Beverly's lips. Peace, she said with a blush. You make me feel like a... What is it you call her? A dime novel heroine? A yellowback girl? Never, said Beverly. Visitors of importance in administration circles came at that moment, and the princess could not refuse to see them. Beverly Calhoun reluctantly departed, but not until after giving a promise to accompany the Lorrys all the way to the rail station. The trunks had gone to be checked, and the household was quieter than it had been in many days. There was an air of depression around the place that had its inception in the room upstairs where a sober-faced Hawkins was serving dinner for a not overly talkative young couple. It'll be all right, dearest, said Lorry, divining his wife's thoughts as she sat staring rather soberly ahead of her. Just as soon as we get to Edelweiss, the whole affair will look so simple that we can laugh at the fears of today. You see, we're a long way away just now. I am only afraid of what may happen before we get there, Gren, said Yetive. He leaned over and he kissed her hand, smiling at the emphasis that she placed on the pronoun. Beverly Calhoun was announced just before coffee was served, and a moment later was in the room. She stopped just inside the door, clicked her little heels together, and gravely brought her hand up to salute. Her eyes were sparkling, and her lips trembled with suppressed excitement. I think I can report to you in Edelweiss next month, General, she said with a soldierly dignity. Her hearers stared at their picturesque recruit, and Hawkins so far forgot himself as to drop Mr. Lorry's lump of sugar on the table instead of the cup. "Explain yourself, Sergeant," finally came from Lorry's lips. The eyes of the princess, though, were beginning to take on a rapturous glow. "May I have a cup of coffee, please, sir? I've been so excited I couldn't eat a mouthful at home," said Beverly. She gracefully slid into the chair that Hawkins offered and broke into giggles that would have resulted in a court-martial if she had been serving under any commander but love. With a plenteous supply of Southern idioms, she succeeded in making them understand that the Major had promised to let her visit friends in the legation at St. Petersburg in April, a month or so after the Lorrys departed. He wanted to know where I'd rather spend the spring, Washington or Lexington, and I told him St. Petersburg. We had a terrible discussion, and neither of us ate a speck at dinner. Mama said it would be all right for me to go to St. Petersburg if Aunt Josephine was still of a mind to go too. You see, Auntie was scared almost out of her boots when she heard there was a prospect of war in Graustark. Just like a tiny little war like that could make any difference all the way up in Russia, hundreds and thousands of miles away. And then I just made Annie say that she would go to St. Petersburg in April, a whole month sooner than she expected to. And then, "You, dear Beverly," cried Yetive. "And St. Petersburg, it really isn't 100,000 miles from Edelweiss. I know that," said Beverly. "It's much less than that," said Lorry with a smile. "But surely you don't expect to come to Edelweiss if we're fighting. We couldn't think of letting you go do that. Your mother would never—" "My mother wasn't afraid of a much bigger war than yours could ever hope to be," said Beverly. "You can't stop me if I want to visit Graustark." "Does your father know that you contemplate this trip?" said Lorry. "No," said Beverly, a little aggressively. "He could stop you, you know." "But he won't know nothing about it," said Beverly. "I could go tell him, you know." "No, you couldn't do anything near as mean as that," said Beverly. "You are not at all that sort of man." And that is the end of chapter 2. I think that's where we're going to leave this tonight. Interesting. Definitely Southern, which honestly gives me a little bit of smile. It might be the only accent I can even kind of do a little bit, so that is definitely good. And interesting cast of characters. That first chapter kind of did feel like a history lesson. And evidently the first book, which might just be called something like Graustark, is all about the character of Lorry and Princess Yetive. But this one is all about Beverly's romance. I feel like it's going to be a very old-fashioned book, but from the writing so far, I think we're going to have a little bit of fun with it. As long as it's not, like, too terribly racist. Anyway, thank you for listening. Please do hit the thumbs up button on your way out if you don't mind. I really do appreciate it. And if you're interested in following along with this book and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, go ahead and hit that. We are going to be reading this for probably the next month. If we do like 2 chapters a day, probably the next month. But no matter what, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So please join me. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you tomorrow.